In a ruthless boot camp where she was ridiculed at every turn, one veteran colonel's reaction to her back tattoo changed everything, forcing everyone to stop, stare, and realize just how powerful a mark on the skin can be. The sun was merciless over the training grounds, beating down on the rows of recruits as they stumbled through push-ups, burpees, and endless sprints. Dust rose in clouds beneath their boots, stinging their eyes and coating their throats. The air was thick with sweat, curses, and the barked orders of drill sergeants. Boot camp was never meant to be kind. It was a place designed to break people down, to strip away comfort and ego until only raw grit remained. And in this particular camp, where every shout echoed like cannon fire, cruelty among the recruits themselves was almost as harsh as the training. The newest arrival was a young woman named Eleanor. From the moment she stepped off the bus, her presence drew stares. She wasn't the tallest, nor the strongest. She didn't swagger like some of the others, nor did she spit back insults with bravado. She carried herself with quiet focus, her eyes steady, her jaw set, as though she had walked through storms far worse than the drills awaiting her. But the others didn't see resilience. They saw weakness. "Hey, careful, she might break a nail," one recruit sneered as Elena adjusted her duffel. "She won't last a week," another muttered during their first run, smirking as he passed her. Mockery was the currency of the barracks, and Elena was an easy target. Every stumble, every slip of her foot, every drop of sweat was met with laughter or biting remarks. The men who jeered the loudest were usually the ones most desperate to hide their own fatigue, but that didn't make the barbs sting any less. Still, Eleanor didn't answer back. She endured. In the barracks at night, while others complained about blisters or boasted about their scores, Elena sat silently on her bunk, patching up her feet or carefully folding her uniform. There was something almost ritualistic about the way she moved, as though discipline came from within rather than from the shouted commands of instructors. Her silence only fed the rumors. Some said she had only joined because she couldn't hack it anywhere else. Others whispered she was there to chase some romantic notion of heroism she'd never find. To them, she was a joke, a shadow trailing behind their bravado. But there was something they didn't know. Hidden beneath her shirt, across the broad plane of her back, was a mark that would silence every sneer and shake even the most hardened among them. The tattoo. It wasn't just ink. It was a story, a legacy, a scar drawn in color. It was the kind of symbol that made men straighten their spines and remember the weight of battles long past. Eleanor carried it not for decoration, not for rebellion, but as a vow. She had hoped to keep it hidden. Boot camp was no place for sentiment, and she wanted no attention drawn to herself. But boot camp had a way of tearing people open, physically, mentally, emotionally. And soon enough, when her uniform shifted under the harsh scrutiny of a drill sergeant, that mark would be seen. And everything would change. For now, though, she remained the quiet one. The recruit mocked, doubted, and overlooked. The others saw only what they wanted to see, someone unworthy of the battlefield they were training for. But boot camp has a way of testing not just muscle, but spirit. And Elena's spirit carried a story that no one here was prepared for. The tattoo on her back wasn't just ink, it was a reminder. A wound turned into a banner, a whisper of a past that demanded to be respected. And when it finally came into the light, no one in that camp, not the recruits, not even the command, himself, would ever look at her the same way again. Morning inspections were a ritual at boot camp. The recruits lined up in perfect rows before dawn, their uniforms stiff and scratchy, their faces still heavy with sleep. The drill sergeant stalked between them like wolves, eyes sharp enough to cut through fabric. Every crease, every loose thread, every scuff on a boot was an excuse to unleash thunder. Eleanor stood among them, her chin high, her shoulders square. She had learned early on that confidence, real or faked, was the only armor against humiliation. Still, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Whispers had already begun that morning. She'd finished her run just seconds behind the fastest man in her squad, and instead of admiration, it sparked irritation. To them, her endurance was an offense, a challenge to the unspoken hierarchy. As the commander approached, silence fell. Unlike the drill sergeants, whose anger was loud and fiery, the commander's authority was ice cold. He didn't need to shout. His mere presence made spines straighten and jaws clench. He stopped in front of Elena, his gaze raked over her uniform, lingering on a loose thread near her collar. "Sloppy," he muttered. Her stomach tightened, but she didn't flinch. "Fix it," he ordered. With quick fingers, Elena tugged at the seam, but as she shifted her shoulders, her shirt rode up slightly, revealing a sliver of her back. The early morning sun caught the edge of it, bold lines, sharp and deliberate, inked deep into her skin. One of the recruits behind her caught sight first. "Hey, look at that," he hissed under his breath. The commander's eyes narrowed. "Turn around." Elena hesitated. For months she had kept the tattoo hidden, not because she was ashamed, but because she knew what it represented. To reveal it here, in front of mocking peers and an unyielding commander, was to bear more than her skin. It was to expose a story that belonged to her alone. "Now!" the commander barked. Slowly she turned. The murmurs spread through the line as the ink came into view. The fabric of her shirt shifted further, uncovering the full image. It wasn't a random design. It wasn't something scrawled for vanity or rebellion. It was an emblem, a crest. The kind of mark worn by soldiers who had fought in battles carved into the very history of the nation. The tattoo stretched across her shoulder blades, intricate and precise. A pair of wings, shaded with almost lifelike detail, cradling within them a blade pointed downward. Beneath it, in elegant but unyielding script, were the names of men and women who had fallen. Her tattoo wasn't just decoration, it was a memorial. The recruits stared, their jeers caught in their throats. What they had mocked as weakness now burned into their minds as something altogether different: strength, sacrifice, and legacy. But the one most shaken was the commander. His face, usually carved in stone, paled as he stepped closer. His eyes locked onto the ink, and for the first time, his composure faltered. He reached out as if to touch it, then pulled his hand back sharply, fists curling at his side. He knew that mark. It wasn't just symbolic. It was personal. Those names, etched forever into Elena's skin, were familiar. They were comrades, people he had once led into battle, people he had buried. The air grew heavy. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. The commander's silence was louder than any scream. Finally, he said in a voice rougher than sandpaper, "Where did you get that?" Elena lifted her chin, her voice steady, though her heart hammered. "I earned it." The words dropped like a stone in water, rippling through the entire line of recruits. In that moment, the balance shifted. She was no longer the quiet girl mocked in the barracks. She was something else entirely, one who carried the weight of the past, and with it a respect no one could deny. And though the recruits didn't yet understand the full story, the commander did. Which was why, for the first time anyone could remember, his eyes softened. The training grounds were silent. Not the disciplined silence of recruits standing at attention, but a silence born of shock. An entire line of young soldiers frozen, eyes wide, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The tattoo glared back at them from Elena's back, bold and unapologetic. Inked wings stretched wide, sheltering a blade, and beneath it, the roll of names etched forever into her skin. Names that didn't belong to strangers, names that had weight. For the recruits, it was awe. For the commander, it was a knife twisting in his chest. His breathing hitched. His vision blurred for a moment, though he fought to steady it. He wasn't a man who allowed emotion to surface. Decades in uniform had trained him to bury grief, to lock it behind rigid discipline. But this tore open wounds he had thought scarred over long ago. Those names. He saw Rodriguez, Patel, Jenkins, men and women he had trained, commanded, and ultimately lost. He remembered the firefight that had taken them, the smoke choking the sky, the crack of gunfire splitting the night. He remembered the weight of responsibility pressing down on him as body bags were loaded onto helicopters. And now, years later, their names stared back at him from the back of a young recruit. "Sir?" one of the drill sergeants asked quietly, concern flickering across his face. The commander didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Elena. "Where did you get that?" he asked again, though his voice cracked under the weight of memory. Elena didn't flinch. "From those who carried me when I couldn't stand, from those who didn't make it back." The words landed like thunder. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances. This was no act of rebellion, no show of defiance. It was history carved in ink. The commander stepped closer, his boots heavy against the packed earth. He was close enough now to see the detail of the tattoo, to trace every line with his eyes, his jaw clenched, his fists curled tight. He turned his gaze to her face, and for the first time he truly saw her. Not as a recruit to be molded, not as a young woman mocked for supposed weakness, but as someone carrying a legacy far heavier than most in this camp would ever understand. "You knew them," he said, voice low, almost reverent. Elena nodded. "I was their shadow, their medic, their family when home felt too far away. I remember every face, every last breath. I wasn't about to let the world forget them." A sharp exhale rippled through the line. The recruits, who had mocked her as fragile, weak, unworthy, stood now in stunned silence. Even the loudest among them couldn't find a word to say. The commander's face, pale just moments before, hardened again. Not with coldness, but with resolve. He straightened, his voice carrying the weight of command once more, though tinged with something no one had heard from him in years. Respect. "Listen well," he said, his eyes sweeping across the line. "That tattoo is not art. It's not rebellion. It's blood. It's sacrifice. It's a reminder of what this uniform truly means. And if any of you think you're here to play games, laugh at others, or treat this as anything less than life or death, remember those names. Because one day, yours might be written beside them." No one dared to breathe. Then, in a gesture so unexpected it left jaws hanging, the commander raised his hand to his brow and saluted Elena. A full, crisp salute, not to her rank, but to her, to the weight she carried. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The girl who had been the target of ridicule, the outcast mocked in the barracks, now stood taller than all of them, the commander's respect, a shield no one could pierce. The recruits looked at her differently, not as someone to scorn, but as someone to follow. And though Elena didn't seek admiration, she accepted their silence with a steady gaze. The tattoo had done what she never could with words. It had spoken for her, and its echo was only just beginning. The barracks had always been noisy at night. Jokes, laughter, the scrape of boots against the floor, and the endless ribbing that recruits threw at each other to mask their exhaustion. Eleanor had been a frequent target of that noise, mocked for her quiet, for her focus, for the way she seemed separate from the chaos. But after the inspection that morning, the air had shifted. When the recruits returned to the barracks, their voices were subdued. The jokes stopped halfway through. The whispers, once filled with insults and taunts, now carried uncertainty, even shame. Eyes followed Elena, but not with mockery. With something else, curiosity, respect, maybe even guilt. She didn't acknowledge it. She moved through the barracks as she always did, calm, collected, silent. But inside, she could feel the weight of the change. It wasn't the kind of silence that isolated her. It was the kind that filled the room like a held breath, waiting for her to speak. She didn't. Instead, she sat on her bunk, unlacing her boots with steady hands. Across the room, two recruits who had laughed the loudest at her during training exchanged uneasy glances. One opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. The other cleared his throat, muttered something about needing to shine his gear, and busied himself. The memory of the tattoo had silenced them more effectively than any punishment could. During drills the next day, the change was even clearer. Where once recruits had raced to outdo her, now they fell in step beside her. Where they once sneered at her silence, now they mirrored it, glancing her way as if searching for cues. The commander hadn't spoken of the tattoo again, but his salute, it lingered in every mind. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a declaration. If the commander himself respected Elena, then no recruit dared disrespect her. Still, respect born of fear is fragile. Elena knew that. She didn't want to be idolized, nor pitied. She wanted them to understand, not her pain, but the lesson the names on her back carried. So when the squad was ordered into a team exercise that evening, Elena made her choice. The drill was brutal, carrying heavy logs through mud, climbing walls, slick with water, dragging weighted dummies across the field. It wasn't designed for individuals, it demanded unity. And unity had never been the squad's strength. They had bickered, mocked, competed. Failure had been constant. But this time was different. When one recruit slipped in the mud, Elena was the first to pull him up. When another faltered under the weight of the log, she shifted her shoulder beneath it without complaint. Her voice, rarely heard, rang out firm and clear. We moved together, no one left behind. The words echoed like a vow. And something in the squad cracked open. The same recruits who had once jeered now gritted their teeth and pushed harder. They stopped racing ahead and started moving as one. When Elena stumbled, hands reached out instinctively to steady her, not out of condescension, but solidarity. By the end of the drill, they were covered in mud, panting, their bodies aching. But for the first time, they had finished without a single failure. As they collapsed onto the ground, one recruit muttered, "Hell, she carried us." Another whispered back, "No, she showed us how to carry each other." The scorn that had once surrounded Elena was gone. In its place was silence, the kind that came with respect, not the shallow kind born from fear of authority, but the deep kind earned through action, through sacrifice, through example. That night, the barracks were quiet again. But this time it wasn't the uneasy hush of guilt, it was the silence of unity. The recruits no longer looked at Elena as an outsider. She was one of them, perhaps the best of them. And though they didn't say it aloud, they all knew the tattoo had changed everything. It had silenced their jeers. It had humbled their pride. And in that silence, they were learning how to become soldiers. The morning sun spilled over the training yard, gilding the recruits in light as they assembled for another day of drills. For once, the chatter was minimal. Boots struck the dirt in unison, and backs stood straighter than usual. There was something in the air that hadn't been there before. Discipline, yes, but also reverence. At the center of it all was Elena. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't wanted it, but the respect of her peers now followed her like a shadow. The tattoo on her back had spoken louder than words, but it was her actions, the quiet leadership, the refusal to let anyone falter, that had cemented it. Still, respect among recruits was one thing, recognition from command was another. That day, the commander called for a full inspection again. The recruits lined up, bracing for the usual cutting remarks, but his tone was different. His gaze lingered longer on each of them, as if measuring not their uniforms, but their spirits. When he reached Eleanor, the air seemed to tighten. The recruits held their breath. The commander's eyes met hers, steady, unyielding. But there was no trace of mockery, no shred of doubt, only acknowledgement. "Step forward," he ordered. Elena obeyed. The commander studied her for a long moment, his jaw working as if wrestling with words too heavy to release. Finally, he spoke, not to her alone, but to everyone assembled. "This recruit," he said, his voice firm, "is more than she appears. She carries a legacy on her back that some of you may never understand. Those names she bears are the names of heroes, men and women who gave their lives in service. I knew them, I fought with them, and I buried them." A ripple went through the ranks. To hear the commander, a man whose voice rarely betrayed emotion, speak of fallen comrades was shocking enough, but to hear him tie that history to Elena, that was something else entirely. "She carries them," the commander continued, his voice tightening, "not as trophies, but as a promise that their sacrifice will not be forgotten, that she will honor them with every step she takes, every battle she fights." He turned back to Elena, his eyes softening in a way no one had ever seen. "And in doing so, she reminds me of my own promise, a promise I once made and nearly let slip." The silence was absolute. Not even the wind dared intrude. Then, in a motion that stunned every recruit, the commander raised his hand in salute. A crisp, deliberate salute, not to a superior officer, but to a recruit, to a young woman still unranked in the eyes of the military. Gasps rippled through the ranks. No one had ever seen anything like it. Elena, her heart hammering, returned the salute, not out of pride but out of respect, for him, for the names on her back, for the weight of history that connected them both. When the commander lowered his hand, he looked over the entire line. "You will follow her example," he said, his voice sharp as steel. "Mockery, arrogance, selfishness, leave them behind. If you want to wear this uniform with honor, then learn what honor looks like. It looks like sacrifice. It looks like carrying the weight of others. It looks like her." The recruits stood taller. No one dared roll their eyes. No one dared smirk. They knew he meant it. They knew he was right. From that day forward, things changed. The respect Elena had earned was no longer silent. It was spoken, visible in the way recruits stepped aside for her, in the way they listened when she spoke. Some even apologized quietly in the barracks, awkward words of regret for the mockery they had once thrown her way. And though Elena accepted their respect with grace, she never let it inflate her pride. She carried it the same way she carried her tattoo, as a responsibility, not a reward. For in her heart, she knew respect wasn't about being seen, it was about honoring the unseen, the names that would never walk these grounds again. The commander had given her recognition, the recruits had given her respect, but the redemption belonged to all of them. Weeks passed, and boot camp no longer felt like the same place. The drills were still grueling, the sergeants still merciless, but the air carried something new, unity. Where recruits had once bickered and competed, they now moved like gears in the same machine, and at the center of that transformation was Elena. She hadn't asked to lead, she hadn't sought glory, yet her presence reshaped the squad. When someone lagged, she was the first to push harder beside them. When fatigue broke spirits, her calm determination held them steady. She didn't command with words, she commanded with example. The tattoo remained hidden most of the time, concealed beneath the standard issue uniform. But its memory lingered. Every recruit who had seen it carried that image with them. The wings, the blade, the names etched in permanence. It was a reminder that behind every order, behind every long run and blistered palm, there was something greater: sacrifice, legacy, honor. For the commander, the shift was even deeper. He found himself watching Elena during drills, not with skepticism, but with something close to pride. Her tattoo had torn open wounds he had long buried, yet instead of leaving him broken, it reminded him why he wore the uniform at all. In her, he saw a continuation of the comrades he had lost, a living testament that their memory endured. One evening, as the recruits rested after a long march, the commander addressed them. His voice was quieter than usual, but it carried weight. "Soldiers," he said, "when you graduate this camp, you'll wear more than a uniform. You'll wear the burden of those who came before you. Remember that. Every step you take is on the shoulders of the fallen." His eyes flicked to Eleanor for a brief moment, and the squad understood. From then on, her story spread. Not in full, she never spoke every detail, but in fragments whispered among the recruits. She became less of a target, and more of a symbol. The girl they had once mocked was now the one they measured themselves against. By the end of training, Eleanor had not only earned her place, she had changed the very spirit of her squad. Where once there had been scorn, there was silence. Where once there had been rivalry, there was respect. And though the tattoo remained ink on her back, its meaning had seeped into every heart around her. It was no longer just her mark, it was theirs. A promise carved in flesh, carried in memory, and lived out in every step forward. A tattoo that had changed everything.